Right. So we finished talking about pupfish in the Mojave Desert. We can represent the pattern that evolution makes through time by branching diagrams like this one. This is an example of something called a cladogram. Um, you see, it's a bunch of lines arranged in a branching shape. Looks almost like I don't know, looks a little bit like your, March Madness bracket, I suppose. Although time actually runs in the other direction from a bracket. There's little numbers on there. You don't need to worry about what those are. Um, they have to do with some statistics that we use for drawing these up, but they're not important for our purposes. What I want you to see is that at the ends of these branches, you've got names of species. So up at the top, you can see C. nevadensis. That's short for Cyprinodon nevadensis. That's the Amargosa pupfish, the very first one we saw on Monday. And then below it, C. diabolus, the devil's hole pupfish. That's the second one that we saw. And then the third and the fourth you can see, and then there's some other ones down there. All of these names are connected with lines, and you can see that lines lead back to common branch points. So for example, C. nevadensis, C. nevadensis amargosi, C. nevadensis shoshone, C. nevadensis myonectes, and C. diabolus, those five up there at the top, go back to a common branch point. And then those five have an earlier branch point with a branch that leads to Cyprinodon salinus. And then those six share a common branch point with the branch that leads to Cyprinodon fontinalis, which we didn't talk about, and so on. We can take this on back. Two or more branches that come from the same point are hypothesized to have descended from a common ancestor. And a lot of what we do in evolutionary biology is come up with and test hypotheses like this. This cladogram that you're seeing is one of many possible hypotheses for how all those pupfish share common ancestors. Just like my sister and I share a more recent common ancestor than either one of us does with my cousin, and my sister and my cousin and I share a more recent common ancestor than I would with somebody I may not knowingly be related to. Yeah, this is what cladograms are about, common ancestry. The way we drew up that one actually involves getting into a little bit of DNA, which we will talk about certainly, but I'm not going to jump the gun. We'll maybe be able to come back to what we can do with the evidence for evolution that DNA gives us. I'll talk about that later. Let's just say that we can use various lines of evidence to push these cladograms farther back. Here, those funny looking names over on the right, Aplochelidae, Posilidae, Cyprinodontidae, and Fundulidae, those are just families of fish. And we think that all pupfish, which are in the family Cyprinodontidae, share a common ancestor with fish known as killifish in the family Fundulidae. And then those two share a common ancestor that was a little farther back in time with fish in the family Posilidae, which includes some fish you might know, guppies. If anybody gets into freshwater aquariums, you might know platyfish and swordtails and mollies. And then guppies, all of these you could go see at any pet store in town. Those belong to that family Posilidae. And so the two below, Cyprinodontidae and Fundulidae, we hypothesize share a common ancestor, and then a more distant common ancestor with the Posilidae as well. and then an even more distant common ancestor with a family called the Aplochilidae. And there's those four, and those fish share common ancestry with other groups. So the Aplochilidae, Poecilidae, Cyprinodontidae, and Fundulidae shares a common ancestor with the Adrianicthidae, Archaeopteridae, Balanidae, Scombrosocidae, Hemeraphidae, Exocetidae, Hemeramphidae, and Exocetidae. And those share a common ancestor with the Bodontidae, Melanotaenidae, Telmotheriinidae, and Pseudomagillidae. I hope you're writing all this down. Actually, I'm not. Don't try to write this down. What I want you to see in this is that it's a big branching diagram. All of those names on the right-hand side of the diagram, many of them next to those colored triangles, all of those names are families of fish. And those names are connected to each other through patterns of common ancestry. And we can keep pushing it back. All those fish now fit into that small little red bracket down there at the bottom. And those share a common ancestor with even more organisms. And we can keep pushing this back and back and back until we end up with something like this. This is a diagram of the current best estimate of the common ancestry of all living and extinct organisms in our current understanding. The last common ancestor of everybody, bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes, from the goo to the zoo to you, is kind of in the center of this. And then every one of those branches leading off from the center represents a descendant of that common ancestor, which gave rise to more descendants, which gave rise to even more descendants, and more and more and more, creating a diagram that we call the tree of life. Darwin's actual writing tends to be a little bit dull. I don't necessarily encourage students to read the book that he published on all of this called On the Origin of Species, which came out in 1859, because reading it is kind of like watching a chess game. If you know the rules of the game, it can be very exciting to watch the strategies being played. If you don't know the rules of the game, it's a couple of dorks periodically picking up a piece, moving it, and hitting a time clock. And that's kind of like what reading Darwin is like. But he did wax a little bit rhapsodic, talking about how he felt this was the best way to represent the ways that evolution worked, that what it fundamentally did was make trees. That organisms live for a time, and then they may, well, sometimes they go extinct. In fact, that happens an awful lot. But under the right circumstances, they will speciate into new species. And those new species can potentially speciate into more species. So think of something like a tree where every branch can send out new branches. And every one of those new branches, once it gets large enough, can send out branches of its own. And you'll have an idea of what the world looks like to an evolutionary biologist. And diagrams like this are hypotheses, and we have lots of ways of testing them, not all of which I can talk about just yet, although I think we'll get to some of it later down the road. But a quick pass through it right now is that those branching diagrams, cladograms, we reconstruct those based on shared characters. What does that mean? Two organisms that share a recent common ancestor are more likely to have features in common than distantly related organisms. So here you've got a fish, a frog, a lizard, a bird, a mouse, and a gorilla. Well, gorillas and mice may not look enormously like each other, but they both have hair or fur. And actually quite a lot of other organisms do as well. For clarity, we're leaving out the dogs and the cats and the deer and the duck-billed platypus and all of that. But rodents and primates share hair, which none of the others have. Not shown on this diagram, they also share features like warm-blooded metabolism, feeding their babies with milk, keeping their babies in a uterus and feeding them before birth through a placenta. Some even more obscure characters like a heel bone that projects backward from the foot joint and a diaphragm muscle, lots of things. And the more features that rodents and primates share in common, the more likely it is, the simplest explanation becomes that they inherited those from a common ancestor. So for example, if you've got a sibling, then you probably share more features in common with that sibling, maybe the shape of your face or the size of your nose or the color of your eyes or what have you. You probably share more features in common with your blood relatives than you would with somebody that we just pulled off the street. It's the same thing here. If two organisms share many features in common, the simplest explanation is that they both inherited them from a common ancestor. If you look, reptiles and birds don't look a great deal like each other, but they both lay eggs that have shells. And then primates, that's gorillas, rodents, birds, and reptiles, all share a feature called the amniotic egg. What that means is that the embryos develop within a set of membranes, of very thin, very flexible sacs. You'd see this if you were to crack open a fertile chicken egg. Mammals obviously don't lay eggs except for platypus and spiny anteaters. But mammals still have the same set of membranes that would surround a developing chicken or a developing lizard. When you were extremely small, you actually had a yolk sac. I think that ends up, now that you mentioned it, I can't quite remember what happens to it, but there was a stage when you were inside your mama when you had one. The amniotic membranes that surrounded you, the so-called bag of waters, if somebody's water breaks when they're about to give birth, there are the same type of membranes in a bird egg or a reptile egg surrounding the developing embryo. They develop in the same way. So the simplest possible explanation is that if we could go far enough back in time, reptiles, birds, and mammals all descend from a common ancestor. And frogs don't have those amniotic shelled eggs, but frogs, lizards, birds, rodents, and primates all share the feature of 4 limbs. So those 5 we think have an even more distant common ancestor, more distant in time. And then all of the organisms shown here have vertebrae, have a backbone basically. And we can keep on pushing this farther and farther back. And the principle that we use for drawing these is that the more features 2 organisms share in common, the likelier it is that they share common ancestry. There are cases where this doesn't work. There are cases where we have to break out some pretty gnarly statistics to work with this, but this is fundamentally how we do it. We look for shared characters. I'll give you another case study on birds. And again, I'm not going to hold you responsible for memorizing details of bird anatomy, but I want you to see how the general principle works. So birds have feathers. The feathers not only keep them very warm, the flight feathers make for a very light but strong wing surface. So the feathers are what enable them to fly. Many bones in a bird are fused together, and that makes the skeleton very light. The bony tail is not present. If you've ever cut up a chicken, chickens don't have long tails like a lizard. They've got those little nub tails. There's a particular arrangement of the shoulder joints that permits a particular type of flapping, a particular type of power stroke. Very large breast muscles. Again, if you've ever cut up a chicken, you've seen how big chicken breasts can get. And they're attached to a breastbone that isn't flat like yours, but it sticks outwards and forms a narrow structure that we call a keel. Yeah, if you get next time you get a rotisserie chicken, if you cut the breasts off your rotisserie chicken, you'll see what looks like a little thin fin of bone sticking up. That's that keeled breastbone, a feature you don't have. So birds are very well adapted for flight. Where did they come from? It turns out that they show a number of pretty detailed similarities with a group that you've heard of called the dinosaurs. One is an S-shaped neck, which you can see up here. You see how that neck is in the shape of an open letter S. You could see that in a goose or a swan. It's not that easy to see in a short-necked bird because the feathers cover everything, but it is there. There's a lower leg bone that's parallel to the tibia called the fibula, and in birds and in dinosaurs, that's reduced. You've seen this if you've ever eaten a chicken drumstick. There's the main bone that holds all the meat on a drumstick. And then to the side of it, you've got this very narrow little, kind of toothpick-shaped little bony splint. That's the fibula. And in birds, the fibula is a lot smaller than the tibia, the main bone of the drumstick. And that's something we see in dinosaurs too. We see loss of digits, fingers and toes. There's a particular type of ankle joint that is shared by dinos and birds. If you really want to look it up, it's called an advanced mesotarsal angle. I'm not going to go into that, but that's why the gods gave us Wikipedia. There's also a hip socket with a perforation. The thigh bone ends in this kind of ball-shaped structure, and that fits into a socket on the pelvis. In you, that socket is basically, a continuous, the socket is a hollow that the ball of your thigh bone fits into, but it's complete. Whereas in birds and dinosaurs, there's actually a hole in that hip socket. We can be more specific and say that birds show more detailed similarities with certain groups of dinosaurs, notably the raptors. In particular, there's a distinctive wrist joint that enables the hand to pivot on the forearm. That's a movement that we can't actually make. And it's something that's important in bird flight because it enables the flight stroke of birds to generate more lift. The fact that part of the wing can swivel. But that swivel joint was present in the raptors. And I know you've all seen Jurassic Park. You know what raptors are. And then birds, raptors, and a group of dinos called the carnosaurs, which includes T-Rex. Those also have shared features. They've got a wishbone. We know they've got narrow, pointy claws. This one's actually shared with more than just birds, raptors, and carnosaurs. Other dinosaurs had this as well. Hollow bones with air sacs inside that in life would have been extensions of the lungs. We can't see the lung sacs in a bone, but we can see the hollow spaces in dinosaur bones, and birds have those as well. So if we put the whole thing together, we can say that birds and, velociraptors and carnosaurs like T-Rex all share a wishbone, hollow bones, and those compressed claws. The simplest explanation is that all three descend from a common ancestor. There was a species sometime in the past that lived, and ultimately a population of that species divided into two new species, and those divided further, and so on. And then within that group, raptors and birds share that swivel wrist joint. And then birds are unique within that group because birds have a lot of bones that are fused. And we can use those sets of nested shared characters to draw a cladogram that looks like that. Based on skeletons, we can add to that. So for example, all dinosaurs and birds share that distinctive ankle joint in the S-shaped neck. One subgroup of dinosaurs called the ornithischians has a particular bone in the lower jaw called the predentary. That includes the armored dinosaurs like Stegosaurus. That was Spike in Land Before Time. And that includes the horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, which I think was like Cappy in Land Before Time. Ducky is also in that group, although there wasn't room for Ducky in this slide, but the duck-billed dinosaurs are in that group too. And then you can see that sauropods, that's like Littlefoot, that's the big, Brachiosaurus and things like that. And carnosaurs like T-Rex and raptors and birds share that feature of having the femur longer than the tibia. Carnosaurs, raptors, and birds have the wishbone, the pointed claws. Raptors and birds share that semilunate carpal. Each one of those tick marks, by the way, each one of these little crossbars on the cladogram means that all of the organisms above that tick mark share that feature. So femur longer than tibia is a feature that's shared by sauropods, carnosaurs, raptors, and birds. The semilunate carpal, that's the swivel wrist joint, is shared by only raptors and birds. So hopefully that will help you read diagrams like this. This is always subject to further testing, by the way. We can go out and we can dig for more bones. We've made some important discoveries in pretty recent years. For example, it's not on this cladogram, but we now know that raptors had feathers because we found over the past 30 years or so some amazingly well-preserved dinosaur skeletons that don't just include bones, but include impressions of what was on the skin. And it turns out that it was feathers. We know that carnosaurs, that's T-Rex and company, small kin of Tyrannosaurus, had feathers. So carnosaurs, raptors, and birds not only share a wishbone, they also share feathers as well. Actually, we can even push that even farther down because of some more recent discoveries. So we can always test this by looking for more evidence, finding more bones, coming up with new things to look for when we look at the anatomy of living critters like birds, and trying to make sense of it through trying to map this onto cladograms and changing our cladograms if the data that we gather doesn't fit. There are some examples of what we call convergent evolution. Every so often, two species that don't share a common ancestor recently will evolve features in common. Since we have a Namibian student here, I'll mention that in some African deserts, you've got succulent plants that belong to a family called the euphorbs. They superficially look like cactus. They're not. They're not that closely related, but both have been shaped by natural selection to be succulent and store a lot of water, which is very useful if you live in a desert. Another one in Australia, there's a lot of weird mammals, and there's a mammal that looks like a mole digging under the soil and nearly blind. That mammal's not closely related to our moles at all. In fact, it's more closely related to kangaroos because it carries its babies in a pouch. But they look very similar because selection has shaped both of them in the same way, and we call that convergent evolution. So we have a few cases of convergence here. Ornithischian dinosaurs like Spike the Stegosaurus and Cappy the Triceratops and Ducky the Hadrosaur have a part of the pelvis that points backwards pointing pubis. And it just so happens that birds share that, even though birds are not most closely related to ornithischian dinos. But birds and these other dinosaurs share a greater majority of characters. You're always going to get some convergent evolution somewhere, but we go by rule of the majority. And the reason I have been pounding on this is people often get the impression that evolution creates a single march of progress from water to land, and every link is more advanced than its predecessors, like successive models of the iPhone. So here on the left, you've got some little blob in the water, and then there's a fish, and then after that, the fish crawls on land and evolves into a mammal, which evolves into a gorilla, which evolves into a caveman, which evolves into a couple of guys. And this is the mental picture that a lot of people have, that it's, you know, successive models replacing their predecessors. What you've got to understand is that evolution doesn't work this way. Evolution makes trees. Species don't evolve their own replacements. Species split, and those splits give rise to new species. And what we try to do is reconstruct that branching pattern. This is a little bit of that branching pattern reconstructed for some fossils of the oldest vertebrates that had a backbone and crawled around on land. You don't really need to see the details on this, but this is what evolutionary biologists do, is try to reconstruct that pattern. I've had people tell me before that cats can't evolve into dogs, and therefore evolution's false. That does happen to be quite true. Cats have not evolved into dogs and probably never will, but that's not the claim. Cats didn't evolve from dogs. Dogs did not evolve from cats. Cats are related through common ancestry because they're both descended from some small mammals running around approximately 40 odd million years ago called miacids. That's a reconstruction of what a miacid would have looked like. In answer to the question I often get asked, we're not sure what color the fur would have been, but we do know the body shape pretty well because we have some pretty good skeletons of miacids. And it was a miacid species that divided into two, and those divided and those split. And after about 40 odd million years, we have dogs and cats and raccoons and bears and ferrets and weasels and seals and quite a lot of other mammals. So the claims that we're making are claims about common ancestry. And the same applies to human evolution. we're not exempt as a species. We are the product of natural selection like everything else that's alive is. And there are lots of fossils that we know about now that indicate very clearly that our own species has changed over time. We have not always looked the way that we do. These are 4 different skulls seen in side view. Now that I think about it, there's none from Namibia that I know of, but the one at the top left was found in South Africa. The other 3 have been found in East Africa. They're all similar to us in critical ways. And they also indicate that our closest living relatives are the African great apes. Every so often, by the way, we find more. And remember, I said this earlier, we can test our hypotheses of how evolution has worked. And one way is by looking for more fossils. In 2015, there was the announcement of the discovery of the remains of 15 individuals of a species that was similar to humans, but not quite the same, named Homo naledi. This is, you can see we're missing some of the face, but we've got most of the skull of Homo naledi and a lot of the postcranium, the part of the body that isn't the skull. Back in 2019, a nearly complete skeleton of a human relative was described from Sterkfontein in South Africa. This one's affectionately known as Littlefoot, not the dinosaur Littlefoot. And just in 2019, we knew about an early human relative that we called Australopithecus annamensis, and we'd known about it since 1995. We didn't know much about it because all we had before 2019 were pieces of the long bones, the arms and the legs, and some teeth. So we couldn't say a lot about what this thing looked like. 2019 was announced that they found a virtually complete skull. Now, there's still more that we don't know. We don't know about the lower jaw or the spine or things like that, but we can make hypotheses as to what the entire critter looked like and then test those with future discoveries. It's all about the hypothesis testing. What we do not do is line these fossils up in a single march of progress. What you're looking at is a famous drawing that was actually published in the 1960s in a book series called Time Life Books. And here you have various species of critter that look human, marching from left to right. There's a knuckle-walking ape called Dryopithecus on the far left, and then a slightly more upright walking ape called Oreopithecus, and then comes Ramapithecus, and then comes Neanderthal man, Homo erectus, and at the far right, Fred the naked white dude. It's funny that diagrams like this always seem to show white guys as the pinnacle and end point of human evolution. And that's fundamentally not how evolution works. This is not what happened. What evolution does is branch, and it gives you trees. This is even outdated. There's some branches on here that we have discovered since this diagram was published. We're always adding more. We're always adding more branches and learning more about the ones that we have. But what you're looking at is each one of these darker blue bars represents a length of time in which a species lived. We have older ones on the bottom of this diagram and younger ones on the top. And the lines that connect them are our current best hypothesis for lines of common ancestry, for what species evolved from what predecessors. The vast majority of these fossils that we find are not direct ancestors of us. in, I guess it was 98, when my grandmother died up in Iowa. Long and full life, died peacefully in her sleep. It wasn't particularly, it was sad, but not tragic. And we all went up to the First United Methodist Church of Iowa Falls, Iowa, and had the service, and then packed down into the church basement for a big potluck, because in Iowa, this is just what you do. The vast majority of people there were not my direct ancestors. The only direct ancestor on that side of the family was my father. And then I guess my grandmother was there in spirit, I would hope. But everybody else that was there was not a direct ancestor. They were my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, my second cousins, my third cousins twice removed, and then all the people that we know we're kin to somehow, but nobody is quite sure how, but we invite them along anyway. If you've come from a large family that has reunions, you probably have been in a similar situation. Most of the people you're related to are not your direct ancestors. And to understand your family or mine, what you would do is not just try to line everybody up in a single line, but try to work out the branching pattern of everybody's ancestry. You know, all of us in that church basement had a common ancestor, my grandmother. But my grandmother had 5 kids, and those kids have all had kids, and some of their kids are having kids now, and so on. So our family tree looks like a branching pattern. It's not a straight line. And on a larger scale, this is what we try to do in evolutionary biology. I'll stop there. And I want to go over that on Friday. I'm going to finish up ranting about evolution on Friday, and then on Monday we take the impending doom. The first exam. So,
What was the date of the first exam again?
we're pushing it to this coming Monday.
Thank you.
March, is it March 2nd?
March 1st.
March 1st. Okay. All right. 1st of March. Okay, there we go. I will stop the recording now.